On today's show, we're going to be talking about running backs, specifically the dead zone. Historically, it has been a huge edge to fade the running back dead zone. But now, average draft positions and the market has changed so much, you can get better running backs in that dead zone, which is historically defined as rounds 3 to 6. So I think just fading the entire running back dead zone is no longer actually right, where I thought it was 100% right a few years ago. Point of today's show is to examine that and then go in one by one through all the running backs currently going in the dead zone and figure out who to actually pick. Why don't we just define this for people who have not maybe heard of this or thought about this too much before, and why it was such a big edge historically?
Yeah, so the running back dead zone, like you said, has been rounds 3 through 6, and it's a spot where running backs going in that range have underperformed versus their ADP, while wide receivers, on the other hand, have often done a lot better than their ADP. And I think the reason why you see the running back dead zone exist, or maybe why it used to exist, was because for a lot of these guys, they weren't maybe supreme talents at the running back position, and they ended up with a pretty lofty ADP just because we didn't have anyone else to project volume for. I think maybe one of the best examples was Mike Davis a couple years ago when he was on the Falcons. I think he had pretty much just been a journeyman throughout his career, hadn't really done anything, but it was really hard to give volume to anyone else on the Falcons that year. And so we ended up with Mike Davis going in the 5th or the 6th round, just something kind of ridiculous given Mike Davis's career arc. And so that's kind of the stereotypical dead zone back, where you look at a player and you say, well, he's in line for 200 carries, mostly because I don't see anyone else on this team who could get that many carries. But what we see so often at the running back position, whether it just be players losing their jobs or getting hurt, is we see these guys underperform time and time again. And that's kind of where, in my opinion, the running back dead zone came to be.
Yeah, I mean, I think the argument now, Leon, and by the way, like I actually was in on Alexander Madison in round 5 because I thought that he was last year, because I thought he was a player historically who would have been going round 2 or round 3. So maybe I should have. I didn't consider Alexander Madison a dead zone back because, again, the ADPs have shifted so much. I thought that round 5 was actually okay for Alexander Madison. Now, we also had other backs last year who went in the dead zone, Leone, like Aaron Jones went there and flopped a bit. Dameon Pierce was a massive flop. Kenneth Walker was okay. Miles Sanders, Madison, Akers turned out to be awful picks. We did get some hits in the dead zone last year with Breece Hall, James Cook, James Conner. And then also I thought it was interesting last year out of the dead zone, guys like Pacheco, Kamara hitting in rounds 7 through 10. So, Leone, I'm curious how you would define dead zone these days and what you thought about what happened last year and how much things have changed.
Yeah, I still think, with a lot of the examples that you gave, that we have to be careful with the backs that we don't think are very talented. It's tough because you have to make a nuanced decision. It's never going to be one thing or another. Like Alexander Madison, I think of like Joe Mixon this year, who I think's probably a good pick. Like, I don't think he's that talented, but I think he's going to be on the field enough. I think the offense is good. But I'm really careful with the backs that have a combination of questionable role, questionable team offense, and questionable talent. We'll talk about like Ramondre Stevenson, who I'm like concerned about in that New England backfield with them bringing in Antonio Gibson and the team scoring not being there. So you can overlook the talent if the price is right, if the offense is right, but it still should be, near the top of your list in terms of primary concerns, especially in terms of explosiveness for these backs.
Yeah. And I know you looked at all this ADP data, Jack. I think this is an important point to touch on, because the point that I just made, how I got kind of trapped into Alexander Madison last year, was I thought in previous iterations of fantasy football, before all people got way more sophisticated, someone like Madison would go round 2, round 3, given his role, given the Vikings offense, given what he'd shown in a backup role before. And then he starts going round 5. And we see this over and over again, where people are getting smarter, and these running backs that used to go earlier are now going late dead zone even. So what can you tell people about how ADPs have changed at the running back position, Jack?
Yeah, I mean, it's really just a seismic change in a span of only a couple of years. In the article I wrote, I had a couple of graphs, one for FFPC, one for Underdog, basically just showing each positional ADP at running back. So you list out RB 1 through 48, and then comparing their overall ADP to where it was 1 or 2 years ago. And what we see is, especially in the mid-range RB2 tier, which is pretty much what the heart of the dead zone was 2-3 years ago, we see that these guys are going 3 rounds later. On FFPC, the RB 17 through 19 group is going more than 3 rounds later than they were just 2 years ago. So it's been a really insane change, with the market getting smarter and the market adjusting so aggressively in a pretty short period of time.
Yeah. I think it can be confusing. The way that I think about running back in general in fantasy is like this. Fantasy points in the running back position largely, not always, but largely come from opportunity. At the wide receiver position, fantasy points come from talent, from being really good at football, being an NFL wide receiver. And so I try to set up my teams so that I have unreal talent at wide receiver, guys who can't be replaced off the street. I mean, just as an example, 2 guys from last year, Miles Sanders was flat benched for Chuba Hubbard. Dameon Pierce was flat iced by Devin Singletary. Whatever wide receiver we take in round 3 through 6, they're not getting benched. Like, they're just not getting replaced by some dust ball off the street. And so again, when I get loaded up at wide receiver, then I get a hero running back or 2, and then figure it out from there with talented timeshare guys. This year, Jaylen Warren for me, Chase Brown, Ty Chandler, Marshawn Lynch, Brian Robinson, Blake Corum, Pollard, Spears, etc. I could keep going. But I guess my point is that's the way I like to set up teams. But now that some of these running backs are going so late, Leone, I find myself questioning myself and taking it more on a case-by-case basis in the dead zone. It sounds like that's what you are trying to do also.
Yeah, I do think it's more case by case. I think kind of what we're seeing, though, to what you're talking about, is when you're building a team, you want a team that's going to crush over the course of the season. You're not building a team for week 1, and that's really important. And that's where people get in trouble. They feel like they need to fill their starting running back 2 spot, and they take a back that's like, oh, well, he's a starting running back on a team. I'm going to slot him in instead of taking an extra wide receiver that's potentially really talented, has a chance to destroy their ADP and fill in for your flex. And there's going to be a chaotic NFL season too. Like, guys are going to get hurt, guys are going to bust and whatnot. So you really want that depth at pass catcher. And you also want to be able to play the waiver wire in home leagues and pick up these running backs that do take these jobs away. There's an anti-fragility there. And that's where, if you're stockpiling running backs too much early, especially the shaky ones, the chaos of the season works against you, where those guys, bust and whatnot. And then these other guys that come out of nowhere and become very productive because, like you said, it's based on opportunity. And some of these guys can work their way into opportunity you might not even have a room for on your roster.
Okay. Let's get into the red dead zone running backs for this season. We're going to go running back through running back by running back through each one now. These are running backs we expect to go in rounds 3 through 6 in home leagues this year. This is in order of FFPC ADP right now. At the end, after we get through this, we're going to talk about some running backs who are going maybe round 3-ish right now in FFPC, but I'm pretty confident they're going to go round 2 in home leagues. That would be Kyren Williams, Devon Achane, Derrick Henry. So we'll get to them after. The first running back, Leone, up in the dead zone on FFPC ADP this year going round 3 is Travis Etienne. We know he had really good opportunity last year as Tank Bigsby absolutely flopped. I know we are higher than market on a lot of Jacksonville stuff that hasn't necessarily flowed through to Travis Etienne, though. How do you think about Travis Etienne as it relates? Is he a dead zone back?
Yeah, I think, if we're using FFPC as a proxy, that means we're looking at early 3rd round for Travis Etienne. And I think I'd consider that a dead zone back there. In some ways he's not, because I do think he's a talented back and it's a solid offense, but there's some concern over the overall pass catching role and if they want to mix in a second back. But for me, it's really just about opportunity cost here, running back versus wide receiver. If you're taking him at the 2-3 turn or early 3rd, you're taking him ahead of Jalen Waddle, Nico Collins, some of these wide receivers, Brandon Ayuk, that are immensely talented and can really win you your league. And I think that's where people might force the running back a little bit too much. So I'm out on Etienne in the early to middle 3rd round.
I think they thought Etienne wore down last year and they wish they could have gotten him off the field a little bit more. They wish that Tank Bigsby or Dearness Johnson was good enough to do so, to get him off the field. They didn't really do that much. They added like a kick returner in Keelan Robinson, but I mean, they did not do that much to help him. So I think the workload's going to be there. for ETN, but totally agree with Leone. I mean, I'm on the clock, no brainer. Give me Jalen Waddle, give me Nico Collins, give me Cooper Kupp, give me Debo Samuel, give me Mike Evans over Travis Etienne. And part of this, I think, is something I talked about on Market Monday. As running backs get pushed back more and more in some of these drafts, we're able to get more and more of these values later. So a little bit of that is understanding your draft room. So yeah, I think ETN, maybe not a typical dead zone back, but one that I'm probably from an opportunity cost perspective out on. Let's go to Isaiah Pacheco, Jack. Now, one thing that we see with these dead zone backs is they lose a lot of pass down work. Isaiah Pacheco certainly lost a lot of pass down work last year to Jerick McKinnon. Jerick McKinnon is currently on the street as a free agent. Would you define Isaiah Pacheco, former round 7 pick in the real NFL draft, as a dead zone back this year?
I view him a little bit similarly to ETN in that I don't think he's just another guy. I think we saw down the stretch last year that the Chiefs really started to have a lot of faith in Pacheco. There is still the McKinnon variable out there. They could sign him at any point, which would put a little bit of a blip onto Pacheco's pass catching outlook. But in terms of would I take him at his current ADP, I don't think I could. I don't think I would. On FFPC, we're talking about Pacheco at 29th overall. Right behind him are Nico Collins and Jalen Waddle. For me, it's pretty easy to say that I would rather have Collins or Waddle over Pacheco. So it's not really a reflection of Pacheco as a player. And on another side, on Underdog, he's going right behind George Pickens. If that's the decision I have to make, I'd take Pacheco over Pickens. But in these home leagues where we expect running backs to maybe trend up a little higher and look closer to FFPC, I would take Collins or Waddle in that tier over Pacheco.
I mean, I'm so confident that home leagues, all these running backs that we're talking about, are going to go higher than they are on the current best ball meta. I did want to get your take on Pacheco, Leone, because he's someone that I've actually taken a lot of in best ball. In home leagues, though, where, like I said, like Jack said, he's going to go around 29th overall we have right now. That is a different story. My bull case for Pacheco just smashing, though, is McKinnon doesn't come back, and you have a ton of pass down work and red zone work. They play McKinnon in the red zone a lot also, did the Chiefs. So I still like Pacheco. I would hate to be out on him. What are your Pacheco thoughts?
Yeah, I guess I just feel similarly to Jack. And while I don't think he's a dead zone back, there is a little bit of this element of like, oh, he's going to get all the pass catch work now that McKinnon's not there. And then like what happens if they sign McKinnon midseason or something and all of a sudden McKinnon earns that role? And that's where you have to be careful with these players where you're like, oh, they have to get this work. And it's like, well, not necessarily, as opposed to some of the backs, especially the backs that go in like the first round, you know, they've earned like a Christian McCaffrey, Bijan Robinson, Breece Hall. No one's taking that work from them because they're that talented. Now, obviously you have to pay a premium on them, but I'm just noting the difference there.
Yeah, for sure. And like Leone said, you could sign Jerick McKinnon as a borderline NFL player at this point. He could come off the street and affect Isaiah Pacheco's projection and role in a huge way. There is no way that anyone's coming off the street to take Jalen Waddle, Nico Collins, Cooper Kupp, Mike Evans, Debo Samuel's role. It's just not happening. All right. Let's keep it moving here to a controversial one. Leone was famously not against Josh Jacobs when he absolutely went nuclear with the Raiders. Now Josh Jacobs is on the Packers. We've talked a lot about the split here between Josh Jacobs and Marshawn Lloyd and potentially A.J. Dillon as well. Leone, is Josh Jacobs now a dead zone back? When he broke out for the Raiders that year, I believe he was like a round 8 pick. I mean, even home leagues, no one wanted Josh Jacobs that year when he went nuts for the Raiders.
But this is how much no one wanted him, is that I've like somehow been attributed a victory on Josh Jacobs for just being like, hey, maybe it's not that bad. That's as far as I wasn't really into Josh Jacobs. I do think Jacobs and the next set of backs we're going to talk about, Rachaad White, James Cook, Joe Mixon, I'm a little bit more into these guys. Again, it's such a hard conversation because before we used to be able to talk about it systematically and just be like, don't take a guy, like Josh Jacobs, who had bad rushing metrics last year, and you've got you've got an incoming rookie running back that, like, who knows, maybe he takes the job from him. But now when we're talking about price adjustments and how I see it playing out this year, it's like, okay, those very premium wide receivers we had to give up if we were to take ETN or Pacheco, now they're off the board. I still think the receivers are probably a better pick here than Jacobs, but it's closer. And I want my running back when, the sacrifice is at the lowest amount, I guess. And I do think that the advanced rushing metrics that he was very poor in last year is a little bit overplayed. It was kind of a lost year for the Raiders and Jacobs heading into free agency and the contract situation with them, where I don't want to overplay it. He got a good deal from the Packers. It's a very good offense. They've talked about utilizing him in the pass game, and he does have workhorse back history that he's earned that. And I do think that's a skill. So, I don't love Jacobs again, but I do think he's a better pick at cost into the middle of the 4th round than Etienne Pacheco in the 3rd.
Yeah. Yeah, this is a tough one for me because I do think that Marshawn Lloyd is going to play a bunch. I do not think they're going to go full workhorse on Josh Jacobs here. So it would take a lot for me to take Josh Jacobs over the wide receivers that go around him. Michael Pittman, Malik Neighbors, Devontae Smith, DJ Moore, Steph Diggs. I mean, that would take a lot for me to take those guys over him. But if I keep doing that, right? If I keep saying, "Oh, I take the wide receiver," I'm gonna end up with no running backs, right? Because you know what I mean, Leone. So like at some point,
100%. Yeah, I know what you mean. Like I'm looking at the list and I'm figuring out, of the list of the guys we're talking about, where I think like the best spot this slot in a running back is. I think ideally, not to get off track too much, but again, going to those 1st round running backs in home leagues that almost push up Bijan, Breece to like top 4. Ahead of some of those receivers, I think are better head to head, but just understanding the way you can roster build and just feeling so confident in their upside cases and their talent and their youth.
Right. Because as we get into the 40s overall here in home leagues, you're going to be able to get Steph Diggs, Zay Flowers. In the 50s, you're going to be able to get Amari Cooper, George Pickens, T. Higgins, Christian Kirk, Tank Dell. Guys were all really high. You're going to be able to get those guys in the 50s, whereas in best ball, those guys were long gone. And so, yeah, like Leone said, getting those elite running back, I really like hero running back in home leagues this year with one of those first 3 guys. I think makes a lot of sense. Let's keep it moving here, Jack. We'll go to Rachaad White. Now, Rachaad White, very good in the pass game, and he has a lot of detractors. A lot of people do not like Rachaad White's game. He's not explosive enough. Everybody at Tampa has struggled to run the ball. I don't want to put it all on Rachaad White, but maybe he's not that good. They did go out and draft Bucky Irving, which maybe not is a great sign for Rachaad White facing competition that he did not face last year. Is Rachaad White a dead zone back, Jack?
I think he's a tricky one because, like you said, I think he's one of the better pass-catching running backs in the league, like truly elite in that facet among other running backs. But he scored out as one of the worst runners. He was negative 0.41 rush yards over expectation. That was among the worst in the league. Like you said, everyone in Tampa struggled to run the ball. But I think there's a pretty good chance that he's just nothing special as a runner, if not below average, but just a very, very good pass catcher. And the Tampa offense is probably going to take a little bit of a step back this year, having lost Dave Canales. And Baker Mayfield also had a career year last year. With that being said, I think it's fair to question how much work Bucky Irving can actually take. He's a smaller back, maybe not cut out for that big of a workload. And I think it would be pretty insane of them to limit Rachaad White's pass catching at all. So I think that he's another guy where I don't think he's like a total dead zone back because I think the pass catching is so valuable. But I'd still rather take the receivers there. And I think at cost, I'd prefer Jacobs to White too.
Yeah, I prefer Jacobs to Rachaad White also because I have concerns about Bucs offense. Like Jack said, without Canales, how good are they going to be? They add Bucky Irving. And last year, they didn't really have a third receiver they trusted. Early reports on Jalen McMillan have been really good. And if Jalen McMillan starts to take a bunch of targets, I don't think that'd be great for Rachaad White. So I would actually consider talent concern, team concern on Rachaad White is probably enough for me to find him as a dead zone back. Let's go to Leone's homerism here. Leone, many times in his life, has drank 30 natty ices and jumped off of a car onto a table and then went out and cheered for James Cook, who absolutely went nuts last year. Did James Cook. James Cook was one of the big hits for me last year. And we're going to talk about some of these backs, round 7 through 10 has historically been pretty strong at the running back position. Certainly was that last year. But yeah, Leone, a lot of changes in Buffalo going on right now. Is James Cook a dead zone back?
Man, I mean, it's tough. I think the good things for James Cook are he does have explosiveness. And I like Rachaad White a little bit more than you guys, but anytime a back's not explosive, and no matter how you feel about Rachaad White, like he's not explosive, they're at risk. James Cook does have explosiveness. So we have that going for him. He can be utilized in the passing game. The offense is good. Those are mostly good. So the concern with Cook is more like the opposite of what it usually is for dead zone backs. It's the overall workload. What are the total touches going to be? Is he going to get the goal line work? And with that in mind, I think he's a little bit better of a bet, given that we're sort of going into this thing understanding, not expecting this huge workload. It's more of an efficiency play from the start. I do have some concerns of them doing gadget stuff with Curtis Samuel. They bring in Ray Davis, who might be the goal line back, but James Cook's efficiency and his ability to be used in the passing game, like he dropped like 4 medium length touchdowns last year. And it's not good that you drop 4 touchdowns, but as Ian Hartitz on Twitter put, not that many running backs are even in the position to drop 4 touchdowns. So I think there's still a little bit of meat on the bone with James Cook in terms of big play potential. And just, again, like framing this if we're not taking James Cook, I don't know if I'm taking any of these backs at cost. So just trying to keep in mind that, none of these are perfect relative to, at every one of these backs, I can find a receiver I'd rather pick. But at some point, unless we're not drafting any running backs or we're not, and there's rookie wide receivers that are going around pick 100 we want to take that we can't take if we've already taken 6-7 wide receivers by that point. So I think Cook's an okay play.
Well, let me ask you this along those lines, Leone. How do you feel about RB starts then? If you don't want to take any of these guys in the dead zone, let's say you started something like, I don't know, Bijan Robinson, and then you come back with, I don't know, Derrick Henry or something like that, or Kyron and Breece Hall or something like that with an RB start, knowing that in the dead zone here, rounds 3 through 6, I think all 3 of us are mostly going to prefer wide receiver over running back there. So what do you think about that?
I think that that's viable. Achane I'd throw in the mix. I do still think that most of the time I want one running back in those first 3 rounds. And, it's CMC, Bijan, Breece, Achane, maybe Taylor, depending where he goes, maybe Gibbs. I think Henry's way overdrafted. I do like Kyron Williams still quite a bit. If I can get 1 to 2 of those guys, I'm happy, but I don't want to press it too much more than that. But I do like to get at least 1. And if you don't have an opportunity to get those backs, that's sort of where James Cook, Rachaad White, Joe Mixon, Josh Jacobs slots in, right? Like you haven't had the option to draft a running back yet. You want at least 1 to give your team maximum upside, especially in a redraft home league where you're not trying to completely shoot the moon and you can beat people on these wide receiver values later. And that's where I think these guys are acceptable picks.
That's my point. And I'm maybe not as opposed as Leone or Jack is to RB starts in home leagues if guys like Christian Kirk and Rome Odunze and Malik Neighbors are going to be going way later than I think they should, way later in a home league. So yeah.
I also think that if you do have 1 running back and 1 receiver through the first 2 rounds, it's not like your choices are 4 straight receivers or take some of these running backs. I think we all agree that we like the tight ends like Trey McBride and Kincaid and Andrews. And I think that we also all agree that there's value to having one of those running quarterbacks that can really reach a top 3 ceiling. So if you're not picking James Cook, you can pick McBride or Anthony Richardson or someone besides a wide receiver, just so you're not exiting the 5th round with 4 wide receivers.
Yeah, spot on.
Okay, let's keep it moving here to Joe Mixon. I know Leone already mentioned Joe Mixon didn't get a ton of pass down work in Cincy. They don't have a ton behind him. They were sour on Dameon Pierce. I still think Dameon Pierce is interesting as a handcuff play to Joe Mixon. Started taking a bit more of him lately. But anyways, Jack, what do you think about Joe Mixon in the dead zone?
Yeah, I kind of think he does fit the definition of a dead zone back. He's a guy who we don't think or we aren't sure is that talented, but we're projecting him for a bunch of volume. It helps it's on a good offense too. And I think with Mixon, it's important to note that just because he fits the stereotypical definition of a dead zone back. He's going late enough that maybe that profile is actually a good bet. We're behind ADP on him right now. If he goes 44th overall, like he is on FFPC, I don't think I would take him there. But if he falls into that 5th, 6th round, that's a guy who 2 or 3 years ago might have been going at the 2-3 turn. And so all of a sudden, even if that profile hasn't worked out at the 2-3 turn, maybe it does in the 5th round. But that's kind of where I'm at on Mixon.
Yeah, for sure. And like Mixon, I know you mentioned it, Leone. This is typical, I think, classic dead zone back profile. The difference for Mixon is I think this offense is going to be one of the best in the league. I also think that CJ Stroud's just going to go nuclear, throwing long touchdowns, and that won't be great for Mixon. But good offense certainly is good for him. Leone, any further Mixon thoughts here?
Yeah, I do think the offense and then the competition stuff too, when like the team goes out and signs you and brings you in, I feel like obviously didn't work out for Miles Sanders in a really bad scenario last year, but I do think more times than not that might buy you a little bit more leeway on like these more important free agent deals than some of these other backs. And also, from here on out, it doesn't look great as far as the rest of the backs we're going to talk about, which shades me sounding like maybe a little bit more optimistic on the previous 3 to 4 we just talked about.
Right, exactly. The rest of these guys we're going to talk about, I really don't like much at all. And that's why, if I don't start RBRB or if I don't have enough running back help early, breaking ties with someone like Etienne or Pacheco or Jacobs or Cook, I'm more okay with. Only other thing I'd say about Mixon is ability to handle a workhorse role. I mean, he's going pretty late for someone who historically handles 20 plus touches, no problem, consistently through the season in games. So
always gets goal line work too.
Yeah. Oh God. He always leads the league in attempts from inside the 5 because he just gets stuffed. It's just how many times we give it to Joe Mixon inside the 5, rack up these stats, but then he just keeps getting it again. Anyways, let's move on here, Leone, to Alvin Kamara going in the dead zone. Alvin Kamara is going to rise because Kendre Miller has fallen off the face of the earth. He's getting called out by Dennis Allen. That has caused a spike in Alvin Kamara's ADP. He's still going to go in the dead zone this year. One thing I know about Alvin Kamara, man, Derek Carr loves to check the ball down, and Alvin Kamara remains elite at catching checkdowns. So in full PPR, I've been okay with Alvin Kamara. Scary at 29 years old, though, with a really worrisome offensive line. You guys can listen to the pod with Thorne about that. But yeah, Leone, any Alvin Kamara thoughts here in the dead zone?
I'm pretty out on Kamara. I mean, if you look at his career, the last 3 seasons, he hasn't cracked 4 yards per carry. 3.7, 4.0, 3.9. That's bad. That's what we expect to see out of a back that could fall off a cliff, entering the age 29 season. The only thing in his favor really is what you mentioned is the check down pass catching stuff. He had some absurd games early in the year in terms of really, really high catch totals.
Yeah.
But with the O-line concerns you mentioned, this team being a little bit concerning overall, I just think that's an easy. I mean, he's going on FFPC at the same pick as Mixon, and that's where I just rather make that bet on Mixon and that offense, even understanding that Kamara has an edge on the pass catching side of things.
75 catches in 13 games last year for Kamara. I mean, just ridiculous. 75 catches in 13 games. But you're going to need something like that again, because I agree with Leone that the rushing efficiency is going to be poor and the touchdown opportunities are going to be poor. So you're going to need, I think you need full PPR, and I think you need to be able to project him for another 60, 70 catches or so for Kamara to pay off. All right, Jack, let's go to Kenneth Walker. Kenneth Walker, it goes in the dead zone. Kenneth Walker is an explosive guy, has gotten killed by analytics Twitter because success rate stuff. He loses yardage a lot. He doesn't get what's blocked. But when Kenneth Walker makes big plays, he makes huge plays. He's kind of, I like that though. Like, it's kind of like the kind of back that I like to have. Now, there's a 70 plus ADP gap between Kenneth Walker and Zach Charbonnet. And that's where I have a hard time, because the way my teams are set up, I get way more Charbonnet range backs than Kenneth Walker range backs. But I do think Kenneth Walker is talented. Jack, what say you about his dead zone prospects?
Yeah, I definitely agree with you that I don't think there should be such a big gap between Walker and Charbonnet, especially with a fully new staff that doesn't have any ties to either of them really. So They both got pretty good draft capital, second round draft capital. So I think that there's some non-zero chance that the staff sees Kenneth Walker get some negative plays a little bit too often for their liking and just starts to favor Charbonnet more. But as far as the backs in this range go, when you're talking about guys like Kamara and Aaron Jones, older backs, like I definitely prefer the more explosive, fun option in Kenneth Walker as opposed to some of these guys who are getting up there in age. But do I actually like Kenneth Walker enough to draft him very often? Not particularly.
Yeah, I think there's some workload risk here with the new regime, as Jack said. Like, it can't get much better on workload, I don't think, for Kenneth Walker, but it could certainly get worse. I believe Leone referred to himself as a Kenneth Walker slappy on the Establish the Edge pod. So I'll give you a chance to retort here on Kenneth Walker.
I mean, listen, these running back prices aren't great. So, but at least with Walker, like we have him priced as running back 17. He's going as running back 17. Some of these other running backs we're about to talk about, we don't even have them as the right running back pick, even if you were to go running back. And with Walker, the floor is definitely scary, but I do think something that separates him a little bit from some of the other dead zoney backs is like a legitimate ceiling. You know, that's when you get in trouble, is when you make floor plays and no one at running back really has a floor. With Walker, we can take the upside. He can break long runs. The new regime stuff isn't great, but if the offense is better than expected and he still gets to goal line work, that's fine. I do think he's at risk, but I actually like the entire Seattle backfield somewhat at cost this year.
All right. Speaking of team risk, let's go to Ramondre Stevenson. Now, just a disaster last year from New England in terms of offensive output. And then Zeke Elliott comes in when Ramondre's hurt and plays reasonably well, also catches a bunch of balls. I mean, one of the worst offensive lines in the league. You have Brissett and Drake May at quarterback. You don't have much in wide receiver weapons. You can go to the site and find the implied team totals. We have team totals for an entire year. Patriots are dead last in implied team total per game for the entire year. That's why I've taken stone cold zero Ramondre Stevenson. Just like, what are we going to get here from a team that's going to score 18, 19 points a game? Am I missing something on Ramondre Stevenson? Leone strikes me as an easy dead zone fade.
I don't think so. I mean, they bring in Antonio Gibson, which, puts at risk some of the pass catching stuff. We had Ramondre highlight. I mean, we have our hits and misses, but we had him highlighted as a dead zone back to kind of avoid last year. And this year, with the offensive expectations for this team, I'm pretty concerned. And there's still, in FFPC ADP order, the guy that goes right in front of him is Tank Dell, so like that's an explosive wide receiver with a lot of upside. And the fact that he's still here, the fact that, Chris Godwin, Marquise Brown go behind Ramondre Stevenson are reasons why, if you did deviate for a Jacobs type, you can still get it back with a receiver here. And I think your 2v2 there is a lot better than if you went, receiver in round 4 and Mondre here over right. Jacobs and a receiver at this point.
Exactly. And that's where the edge is, right? That's where the edge is on the dead zone stuff. Our opponents are taking Ramondre Stevenson and we are taking Tank Dell, Chris Godwin, Terry McLaurin, Marquise Brown, T. Higgins, Christian Kirk. We're just smashing people there, I think. So that, to me, that's an easy-ish one. Let's go to Aaron Jones, Jack. Aaron Jones, I think the Packers were fed up with Aaron Jones constantly being nicked, not only out of games, but just like nicked in a lot of games, not able to handle big workloads. They let Aaron Jones go. He does have vengeance in his heart. I mean, he wants revenge on the Packers. He is not happy about what happened. Signs with division rival Vikings. They do have Ty Chandler there. Now, Aaron Jones goes a bit later, right? Like he's going 65th overall on FFPC. Jack, what do you think about Aaron Jones as we get towards kind of the back part of the dead zone here?
Yeah, he is going later than these guys, but I still am not super into Aaron Jones. He turns 30 years old in December. He has a history of soft tissue injuries, including one that he dealt with for most of last year. When he was on the field last year, he was still efficient. He averaged 4.6 yards per carry, which was actually a career low, but is still very good. But I think just going in a huge downgrade in team environment, going from a team with, Jordan Love at quarterback to JJ McCarthy / Sam Darnold, even if the Vikings have weapons at their disposal, I'm not sure the quarterbacks are going to be good enough for them to really score a whole bunch of points. And so when you combine that with Jones getting up there in age and the injury history, it's just, I'm not super into drafting a 29, soon to be 30-year-old running back in the 6th round on a pretty below average offense.
Yes. And I actually think the team likes Ty Chandler. Like, Kevin O'Connell has gone out of his way to compliment Ty Chandler repeatedly this offseason. I take Ty Chandler a ton. He goes in the 140s or so. And yeah, I feel much better about that than Aaron Jones here. Leone, this one is fitting for you. An old that always shoves it down my throat in James Conner. In DFS, he shoves it down my throat. In season long, he shoves it down my throat. I just always underrating this guy. Now, the knock on him, I think, is true. He's always hurt. He always misses, 2, 3, 4 games. He's always banged up. But man, he has been quietly, sneakily productive. And you could say last year was one of his best years of his entire career was James Conner. And I really think Arizona offense is going to put up a ton of points this year. Now, I can't get there drafting James Conner, but I have so much bias against him. Maybe I should be. Leone, we're getting pretty late here. James Conner ADP on FFPC is 67th overall, the RB 20.
Yeah, I just think it's too rich. I'm a little bit worried that, same as you, that he'll make me pay again. But the issue with Conner, I mean, the pros for Conner is he was like legitimately good last year. Like any advanced rushing metrics, he was good. He is kind of like has that workhorse ability, so to speak. But anytime you get an aging running back and you're looking at a team that drafted a running back relatively early in Trey Benson, who's a bit explosive, I have concerns, what's going to happen the second half of the season down the stretch. And again, I'm not drafting for day one. If we were drafting just the first 4 weeks of the season, James Conner would be perfectly fine here. But I definitely have concerns over the younger back siphoning off enough of a role from Conner, even if Conner doesn't get hurt. And then you just layer in some of the age and health risk stuff on top of it. And I'm out, but I do worry a little bit more about this one than, say, like the next one.
Yeah, important note there from Leone. If you're looking at our rankings, we are trying to value back-weighted production more. It is way more valuable to have guys breaking out and playing well during the bye weeks. Once injuries hit, it is not nearly as valuable to have guys playing well in weeks 1 through 4. We don't have injuries. We don't have byes. We all have really, really good teams. So yeah, if you're using our rankings, understand that it's not meant to have the best team in week 1. It's meant to try to give us the best team for the fantasy playoffs and leading up to the fantasy playoffs. All right. Last one here that goes in the dead zone on FFPC, Jack, is Zamir White. Now, Zamir White, if you followed on Twitter, is going viral because he's jacked. Similar to Mike Davis, similar to A.J. Dillon, that is not a reason to take a running back. I do think the positive for Zamir White is the Raiders love him. Like, he's Antonio Pierce is kind of old school boomer. And I don't even mean that in a bad way. I actually really like Antonio Pierce, but he likes the kind of back that Zamir White is. Showed an ability late last year to handle really big workloads. When the Raiders get behind, Zamir White's going to have a problem. They have Dylan Lobb, and they have Amir Abdullah, who can give them some pass down snaps. Also, Jack, what do you think about Zamir White here as the last running back of the dead zone?
Yeah, I think profile-wise, this is pretty much exactly the definition of a dead zone back. He is a former day 3 pick with 4 starting games under his belt in his entire career. He's on a bad team, and the only reason he's going this high is because we don't know who else to give carries to. I guess the question for me is, where would he have gone 2 years ago? And he probably would have gone in the 5th round. Now he's going early in the 7th. His ADP is 74 on FFPC. So it's, I think in a vacuum, the probability of Zamir White working out is pretty low, but at a cost that is 2 rounds cheaper than what it would have been 2 years ago, is that an okay bet? I lean no. I'm still not really drafting Zamir White, but it's an interesting question.
Sure. And on FFPC right now, guys going after Zamir White include Calvin Ridley, Keenan Allen, Deontay Johnson, Rashee Rice, Brock Bowers, Jaden Reed, CJ Stroud, Christian Watson, it'd be hard for me to take Zamir White over those guys. I think on a per week basis, especially on half PPR, Zamir White's probably going to project reasonably for us. We're going to, assuming they don't do anything in games where it's going to be close or we think the Raiders can win, we're going to have to give Zamir White like 18 or 19 carries, right, Leone? I mean, and he's going to project well on a weekly basis over the course of the season. You're going to have more problems, though, I think, with Zamir.
And they signed Alexander Mattison, too. Like, who knows if that's more of a split than we think. I'd much rather draft David Montgomery, whose ADP is after. And with him, he's on a really good team. We're expecting a lot of touchdowns. He projects similar to White for us, with us knowing that Jahmyr Gibbs is ahead. And then you have that contingency upside where like the fragility works more in his favor. Whereas for White, it like can almost only get worse, from this point moving forward.
All right. Those are the backs currently going in rounds 3 through 6 on FFPC. I think that was a helpful exercise for everyone. Hopefully that it was. Before we get out of here, I did want to touch on 3 backs who are kind of going close to the dead zone in FFPC, but I think will go way higher in your home league. That is Kyren Williams, De'Von Achane, Derrick Henry. Leone, I want to start with Kyren. Kyren was not thought to be a talented back or a super talented back, but Sean McVay has loved him for a long time and went absolutely nuts last year. Listen to the Thorn Pod. He thinks the Rams might have the best interior run blocking offensive line in the entire league. I would not call Kyren Williams a dead zone back, but I could see how you can make that case, say, well, he's not that talented. They just drafted Blake Corum, et cetera, et cetera. He's going to go round 2, though. So I think so. Not dead zone. What do you think about Kyren?
I think the upside just immense for the Rams backfield. Maybe a little shaky in round 2. Like best ball, we've gotten greedy in some of these leagues. We can take him in round 3. And after sort of this wide receiver tier falls off a little bit, and I obviously like that a lot more. But he did show ability to be involved in all facets of the game for the Rams last year. A huge snap share. The drafting of Blake Corum's a little concerning, but if I'm reading the tea leaves right, it's more like we don't want Kyren to play 95% of the snaps anymore. We want to play 80% of the snaps, and he's still getting all the high value touches. And if that's correct, I think it's just a matter of does he stay healthy or not? And if he stays healthy, I think he'll be a pretty good pick there and does have the ceiling that's necessary to take a guy in round 2. I'll let Jack talk about Achane, but I just want to say, like, in home leagues, there's a chance that his ADP actually doesn't get pushed up because he's a little bit different of a bet than some of these other guys. I saw someone on Twitter reference James Cook's ESPN ADP being higher earlier than Devin Achane. So there's a chance that he is someone that actually we like at his home league ADP.
Yeah, that's insane. And we'll be going over the default rankings in the draft applets on ESPN, Yahoo, Sleeper soon. And we'll look at stuff like that where James Cook is ranked ahead of De'Von Achane, if that's true or not. Actually, I haven't looked at that myself yet. Yeah, the more we've talked about this, actually, after doing this show, I'm actually more confident than before that I'm fine with Achane or Kyren in round 2. Like, I'm more confident now than I was before because I'm thinking I'm going to be on the clock deciding between Josh Jacobs and like Malik Neighbors. And I'm just like, I can't, you know what I mean? So I'm more confident now with these guys in round 2, I guess is my point.
Yeah, I was going to say, it's not just that we like the wide receivers more, but we're also, at least early on, pretty different than the market on the wide receiver rankings. So when you combine that, like, we're different in terms of like who wide receiver 15 is, like we could be off by 5 spots positionally. And then we also like the wide receivers more. There's going to be a lot of opportunities beyond, in rounds 3 through 10, really, in your home league drafts to get wide receivers. And as Jack noted, it's a good year to be greedy and try and like get it all, like get the really good tight ends too. There's like 6 or 7 of them that you can grab. And, if you do the hero RB thing, you can grab one of those tight ends and still get a whole bunch of strong wide receiver values and avoid a lot of the backs that are shaky that we talked about today.
I'm just picturing in my head like the most absurd home league team that I actually think I can actually get now after doing this podcast. I'm just picturing it in my head. And part of it might actually include De'Von Achane because, as Leone said, I think like Tom from accounting, who doesn't listen to the ETR podcast at all, is going to think De'Von Achane's not going to touch the ball more than 12 times a game or 13 times a game. How can we possibly take him in round 2 or round 3? It's not enough projectable volume. What we saw from Achane last year is a combination of outrageous talent, which is not dead zone at all, obviously, with Mike McDaniel's scheme, which obviously puts players in a huge position to succeed. So by no definition whatsoever is Achane a dead zone back. He might go there, but by no definition is he a dead zone back. And man, if he goes in round 3 or round 4 of a home league, that is an absolute smash. Anything to add on Achane here, Jack?
Yeah, I just think Achane could have a really wide range of outcomes in terms of where he goes, like what his ADP is in home leagues. Because, like, yeah, someone could say that he's not going to get 12 touches a game, or he's only going to get 12 touches a game, or someone could just like look at his yards per carry and pick him in the first round. So I think it depends a lot on your league. But I definitely think that if you get to like the late second territory, that Achane's pretty viable there.
For sure. Last one, Leone, is one that has been a struggle for us basically for the last decade, I would say, in DFS, which is Derrick Henry.
Oh, man.
Hard to project well, difficult to project well because he doesn't historically catch passes, and Lamar Jackson historically does not throw the ball to running back. We have Derrick Henry, I believe Leone can confirm, with the most rushing touchdowns in the league, and we're still way behind market on Derrick Henry versus ADP. The assumption, even my kid is 9. He was like, Dad, did you know Derrick Henry's on the Ravens now with Lamar? And I was like, yeah. And he was like, Derrick Henry's going to score 30 touchdowns. I was like, I know Derrick Henry's going to score. He's going to score 30 touchdowns on the Ravens, but he might, to pay off this ADP, maybe he actually needs to score like 18, 19 touchdowns or something, Leone. So I know this is one that we're going to be behind on, but man, if you look at that bell curve, the IQ bell curve meme, it's going to look real bad if we overthink this. And my kid said Derrick Henry's going to score 20 touchdowns, and the 160 IQ people say that Derrick Henry's going to score 20 touchdowns also. So what do you think about Derrick Henry? Is he dead zone? What do you think, Leone?
Man, yeah, I just think it's difficult, especially, in the half PPR leagues, I get a little bit more where that emphasis on the touchdowns matters a lot more. But we're projecting him to catch 20 balls. I mean, this guy that doesn't catch a lot of passes, playing on an offense that doesn't throw to the running backs a whole lot. Historically, I think it's going to change what they've done historically in terms of the RB allocation, where it's been spread out a bit more. The question is how much, is it going to be? And right now we've got Derrick Henry, I think, for right just under 250 carries. If you think he gets 290 carries, which, Adam, I know we were talking about and you thought there was a chance he does, he's probably fine. If you think he gets that workload in conjunction with the touchdowns, if he's going to be south of 250 carries, whether it's due to missed time and his age, the way they allocate stuff, the fact that Lamar takes rushing attempts, even with a lot of touchdowns, it's going to be tough in conjunction with not having that pass catching role, just prop him up. He's got to score basically weekly.
Yeah. I think two things. There is selection bias on outliers who make it this far. Derrick Henry will be 31 in January and has 2,000 NFL carries on his body already. Guys that make it this far, I don't want to use historical stuff on AgeCliff because actually underlying data on Derrick Henry last year was still really strong. It's just the Titans offensive line was so bad. He was not getting anything that before getting contacted. So Ravens offensive line has question marks also. We talked about that with Thorne, but overall offensive efficiency and touchdown opportunities should be way better. So in half PPR, like Leone said, I'm more in, I think, on Derrick Henry. I've not taken him once in full PPR. But Jack, this is a guy that's going to go way higher in home leagues. If Derrick Henry makes it out of the top 20 in home leagues, I'll be shocked. I mean, absolutely shocked. So that's probably going to end up being too rich for me there. But yeah, Jack, any Derrick Henry thoughts before we get out of here?
Yeah, I definitely agree that he's probably going to go higher in home leagues, and I generally agree with Leone that I don't think I could pull the trigger that early if he makes it into the third round and it's not full PPR. I think you could tell yourself a story about how he absolutely smashes and maybe you pick him knowing that you want to load up on receiver later. But in practice, I don't think that's what's going to happen.
Yeah. He is so clearly an outlier, right? And I know I've gone on these rants before about trying to pick the outliers that can do truly superhuman things, cost people a ton of money, more than they make when they find one. However, once someone has identified themselves as an outlier, and Derrick Henry has done that over and over and over again, I do think that we have to take note of that. So yeah, I'm certainly open, probably more open than these guys are, to Derrick Henry in late round 2 and half PPR. All right. That is going to do it for our look at the dead zone running backs for this year. Appreciate all of you being here. Be sure you're subscribed to our YouTube and our iTunes feed. Those are both indeed free. And be sure you check out our bundle. If you plan to play DFS this year, if you plan to be very serious about fantasy this year, you need the bundle, combines draft kit with our in-season product. For Leone, for Jack, for producer Luke, for producer Ryan, I am Adam. Good luck, everybody.